geography involved with, if you get two pictures that partially overlap, there's a way that you can actually extract the information about whatever the object that's being photographed is. And this is just kind of a case of two different views with a photograph at the top of a building, and being able to figure out the actual dimensions of the real object using two photographs. But thankfully, the photogrammetry software does all this for you. You don't have to do any calculations yourself, which is a relief to me because I'm not very mathematically inclined. Let's see, yeah, I'll give you some examples of photogrammetry. Before we kind of focus on archaeology, which is the main focus, I thought I'd at least give you some examples of how this technology is really revolutionizing a lot of other fields besides archaeology. So one example is that law enforcement is using photogrammetry. So examples of crime scenes, or like in this case, a mysterious footprint left behind by a possible criminal. And so what you might do, if you take just a photograph of the footprint, because a footprint is ephemeral, and if this is the criminal that you're trying to catch, a photograph is better than nothing. But if you do some photogrammetry of this footprint, you have a 3D model of the footprint, which would allow people to maybe figure out that the depth of the footprint tells you how much the person weighed, right? So law enforcement people increasingly are using photogrammetry to document crime scenes or suspected footprints of a criminal, that kind of thing. So increasingly you're seeing that in law enforcement. Oops. Let's see, agriculture is another use of photogrammetry. This is aerial photogrammetry, probably a drone flying over an agricultural field. So it's a quick way for farmers who have access to a drone that they can actually take a photograph of their field and figure out how irrigation is working in the field. So the image on the left is just an aerial photograph of a field. The image on the right has been manipulated so that you can see what areas are dry and what areas are wet. And in this case, the red is indicating areas that are drier, so the farmer is going to be able to tell, and then there's some kind of a problem here with the irrigation. So it's a way of monitoring crops, so it's used in agricultural practices too. Oh yeah, in construction, I learned a lot about this. This is a really popular technique in construction. So at construction sites, photogrammetry is used to do a couple of things. One is that it's used to just take an inventory of materials and supplies at a construction site. Another use of photogrammetry at construction sites that I learned a lot about is that these tall buildings, the skyscrapers here, when they're being built, one thing that you have to do if you're a construction person is you have to make sure all of the windows are intact. And so you have to do inspections of your new building. Before photogrammetry, before drones, the way to do that is it's a very dangerous work. You have to send someone up to inspect the building, every little piece to make sure that everything is being built correctly. But it's very dangerous, it's very time consuming. But of course now what you can do is you send a drone up, do some photogrammetry, and you can create a 3D model of the construction site, and you can, from the safety of a computer and in your office, you can actually see what parts of the building might need to be fixed, what parts look good, and so construction work is also a place where there's lots of photogrammetry happening. And then of course archaeology. Well, this is really the main focus. Archaeology is being used in terms of photogrammetry as well. So this is just an example of an excavation trench. All right, we've probably all done at some point, some kind of excavations where you have to make drawings of the profile, right, and taking photographs of it. But if you do photogrammetry, you can create a high resolution 3D image of a test trench, so that after the excavation is done, you can go back and study things that you might not have noticed when you're in the field. You can go back and study and see things differently if you have a record of it. And the other thing that's great about photogrammetry is that it doesn't take a whole lot of time in the field to take photographs and then put them all together and create a 3D profile of an excavation trench. So lots of uses in archaeology as well. So just a few examples of the uses of photogrammetry. There are others, but those are just ones to kind of give you an idea of the kinds of uses in photogrammetry. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about is a little bit about the history of photogrammetry. Kind of where this all started from and kind of where we're at today with photogrammetry. And then I like researching this kind of thing, like just the history of how things develop over time. So I kind of had fun doing some research on this in terms of a basic timeline. So I think, the beginnings of photogrammetry really start with just the mathematics of projection. Projection meaning that how to represent a three-dimensional object in 2 dimensions, and the basic mathematics of that is really the beginnings, what ultimately would become photogrammetry. So I thought I'd share just some early examples of people working on this. So Leonardo da Vinci, guy did a lot of things, and one of the things, this is just a sketch. There's no evidence that he actually made this, but you can see it's a sketch. This is actually a self-portrait of Da Vinci here, and it's a sketch, and he's thinking about how to represent a 3-dimensional sphere here on 2-dimensional paper using light, and then being able to see through and then draw what he sees, realistically on a 2-dimensional paper. It's kind of the earliest evidence of this kind of thing. I think, this is 1480. Here's another early example of projection. This is an artist's drawing of people trying to draw a 3-dimensional object, in this case a lute, a musical instrument known as a lute. And the way that you can do this is this person is putting points on the lute, and this person is trying to draw it. And this is the representation. So you're trying to draw a 3-dimensional object on a 2-dimensional surface very accurately, and using projection of how the back of the instrument here gets projected onto the paper, and you would know where to put the point so that you can create a very realistic drawing of that 3-dimensional object on a piece of paper. So again, this is hundreds of years ago, but it's kind of the basis for ultimately some photogrammetry techniques. So of course the next step in the evolution of photogrammetry is the invention of photography. And so I wish I'd had more photography classes. That's one thing I always tell my students. If you want an elective that you're looking for something to take a class in photography, I wish I knew more about photography. And I'm sure in a lot of photography classes, you would actually get a little bit of the history. This is the oldest known photograph that I could find. I think it was taken in France. And don't ask me about how they actually did the photograph. I think it's a pinhole camera. I don't know, maybe some of you know about pinhole cameras and how a small little aperture lets the light through, and then it gets projected. And then there's a way that you can actually create a photograph. So I think this was taken outside of an apartment window in France, and it's at least the oldest known photograph from the 1820s. Let's see. So photography is going to be an important part. Airplanes are going to be another really important part of this. And I really like to talk about this. I teach, in addition to archaeology, I teach a geography class. And we talk a lot about how aerial photography must have been, we are so used to seeing aerial photos, but the first time actually seeing an aerial photograph must have been a very interesting thing to see for the first time. It changes your perception of the world. Up until that moment, you can only just imagine what a bird would see from the top down. This is the oldest, I know that there's earlier photographs, I think, if I'm not mistaken, they were taken in Paris. These are hot air balloons. This is long before airplanes, but hot air balloons, people would go up in the hot air balloon with a camera and take photos. So I think there are earlier photographs from Paris, but they were destroyed or lost or something like that. And so as far as I know, this is the earliest surviving aerial photograph, and it was taken in Boston in the United States. So this is from 1860. And so for the first time, people really could see what things look like from above, and that must have been a very, very exciting time for that kind of thing. And then, of course, airplanes come about in the early 1900s, earliest aircraft there in North Carolina in the United States, and of course that really starts to change everything. So the beginnings of photogrammetry really it's analog, it's not digital, and this is actually a device, and I'm old enough to have used one of these things before. What you do is you take two pictures that are partially overlapping, and then you put this device on it, and when you look through it, it actually looks three-dimensional. It's like your eyes are tricked into thinking that you can see, actual relief, topography on the aerial photographs. And so that's kind of the beginnings. And you can actually figure out the scale of the photographs. So not only is it just interesting to see three dimensions, but you can use it to measure things. You can actually figure out the scale. And of course you have to use a pencil to measure things, but you can actually get information from these photographs as well. So that's kind of the beginnings of actual photogrammetry, which again starts with an actual analog physical copy. So of course computers are involved, some of the earliest computers. I think this is from the 1940s. Thankfully, we have come a long way since these older computers. Computers are going to be very important in photogrammetry because, of course, they can do things much more rapidly, doing the calculations of photogrammetry much more rapidly than you can otherwise. So you got computers into the scene, and then digital photography. I didn't know that digital photography actually goes back to the 1970s. I think I just sort of assumed. I think I remember hearing about digital cameras maybe in the 1990s, but they were far too expensive for me to deal with. But the first digital photography actually came out in the 1970s. So it's been around 50 years since the very first digital cameras that were very expensive and not particularly good. But that, again, is a really important element for understanding kind of where digital photogrammetry is today. So the invention of things like digital cameras, and then where we are today with photogrammetry. And essentially what today, the reason that photogrammetry has taken off so much is that you have smartphones everywhere, the explosion of smartphones, and virtually everyone has a smartphone, so everyone has a good digital camera. And the availability of software. There's lots of different softwares for photogrammetry. I'll just highlight a couple of them. The one that I'm most familiar with, and it seems like it's a fairly standard software that's used, the one that you have the demo for is Agisoft Metashape. And I'm not saying that's the best software. The full version of it, of course, costs money. It's not open source, but that's the one that I'm most familiar with. There are other kinds of photogrammetry software out there. I was going to try to look into Meshroom a little bit more. Meshroom is important because I do know it's open source. It's free, but I haven't used it before, so that might be something that we could, try out if we have time. Maybe someone can download Meshroom and we can see what it's about. But I think all the photogrammetry software is fairly similar in terms of how it works, in terms of how you load photos to it and then ultimately start to create three-dimensional images. I think they're all fairly similar, but there's lots of different examples of photogrammetry software. But Metashape just happens to be the one that when I first started learning about photogrammetry, the person that had done photogrammetry that I knew said, oh yeah, Metashape is something. So that was just how I learned what was by using Metashape for my photogrammetry. Okay, let's see. Oh yeah, and so smartphones plus software that becomes more commercially available really has led to an explosion of photogrammetry in all of these different fields, including archaeology, because archaeologists, we didn't invent photogrammetry, but we were quickly, and kind of like radiocarbon dating. Archaeologists didn't invent radiocarbon dating, but we were quick to realize, hey, this is important for our field. And so that's what's happening to archaeologists today, is that quickly archaeologists are picking up on this is really a relevant technology to use in the world of archaeology. And this is just an example. So these are a chart that I found. Unfortunately, it goes up to 2019, so it's a little bit dated, but you can see that the trend of number of cited, not just publications, but cited publications in archaeology, going back into the ancient 1980s, and this gets up to 2019. And I'm guessing, this is just a guess, but I'm guessing that maybe the pandemic slowed things down, or maybe actually I'm guessing the pandemic probably people were stuck at home, and they probably did more photogrammetry work, but no one was doing field work during the pandemic. So I'm guessing there was probably a little drop off when no one was doing field work during the pandemic, but I'm guessing it's probably up to here by now in 2023.
Yeah.
What's that?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, or maybe even higher through the ceiling of this. So it's just been, as you can see, a trend of more and more uses of photogrammetry. Any questions so far? Questions?
Could you move to the next slide?
The previous slide, yeah. This one?
There's one mentioned Polycam. So is that kind of software which is working on the 3D dimension, or what
Polycam.
kind of software it is?
Yeah, I've never used Polycam. Actually,
Yeah, we use Polycam.
You use Polycam.
Last time I heard regarding the Polycam through Ma'am Osma when she visited to the Abdul University, and I think that was not open source.
It's not open source, but they do have a free version.
Yeah.
So you can, it's not as, you can't do too much with it, but you can get some. Zen can tell you more. Zen, do you want to talk a bit about Polycam?
Yeah.
इसके बारे में बोल उर्दू में बोल। Polycam इसके बहुत इस्तेमाल किया।
स्टार्टिंग में वैसे मैंने जो है वो पॉलीकैम इस्तेमाल किया था, जिसमें मैम ने बताया कि लिमिटेड है. इफ़ यू आर यूजिंग द ट्रायल और फ्री वर्जन you can only upload a few images to draw 3D or photogrammetry. And in paid version there is limits. The limits are extended.
Maybe have measurements.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think
Photo that we are
we do not
using
only get